Throughout this mini-series, we've dismantled one of economics' most persistent myths, that practitioners must choose between reduced form and structural methods. We've seen that this supposed dichotomy is actually more of a spectrum. Some models have less structure, and some have more. We've also explored when having more structure is useful, as well as when less structure might be sufficient. We've also covered the methodological war that ravaged the profession for decades. But one thing we haven't covered yet is what happens when the best researchers combine the best of methods across the spectrum. What do we get when we combine the best of all of these approaches? Today, we're going to see this integration in action. We're going to look at a study in India that tackled one of development economics' most important questions. What is the true societal benefit of having school choice? In other words, how much consumer surplus do households receive because they have the ability to choose where to send their children to school? This isn't just a case study, it's a blueprint for the future of empirical economics. Because as we'll see, neither side of the spectrum alone could have gotten the right answer in this situation. The setting is rural Andhra Pradesh, India, and here private schools charge about 8% of household income for their tuition and fees. The experimental design was quite elegant. The researchers leveraged a two-stage randomization, where in the first stage, they randomized whether a village gets the opportunity to have these school vouchers. And then in the second stage, within a village that was randomized to have the vouchers, there's further randomization at the household level regarding who actually got the voucher. This created something very crucial for the identification of this consumer surplus that we're interested in estimating. The control villages did not have any kind of spillovers where some households who got the voucher might have impacted indirectly households who didn't get the voucher. This project was so involved that the researchers actually wrote two different papers. In the first paper, they explained the randomization and they estimated a structural model only on the control villages. This would be akin to just getting observational data and estimating a structural model, which is very typical in parts of econometrics. And the key in this part of the project is that the researchers were able to test different structural models only on the control villages. And then the key idea is that by estimating only on the control villages, the researchers could then validate their structural model by looking at how it would fit out of sample in the treatment villages. So this is a brief overview of what the design looked like. So there's control villages, there's treatment villages, and we're looking at kindergartners, so we're looking at the very beginning part of primary school. In both sets of villages, families would apply for the voucher, but they only got the voucher if their village both was randomized to receive the vouchers and their household was randomized to receive the vouchers. So this shaded group in the top left serves as a really good control group for households in the top right. So the researchers in the first paper, they're able to estimate structural models and test out different specifications, and then in the second paper, they're going to validate what they found. So the top line result of the paper is that the structural model, so we're looking at this voucher winners row of table 2 here, the structural model severely underpredicted the take-up rate of the vouchers. So this is asking of the households that were randomized to receive a voucher, how many actually used it. In the data, 83% of those who were given the offer took it up, but the structural models predicted anywhere from 25 percentage points to 15 percentage points lower of a take-up rate, which is very substantial. The other thing that the model missed is that they predicted that the schools that the voucher recipients would go to charged much higher tuition than they actually did. So what happened was the voucher recipients that took up the offer ended up attending schools that had lower tuition than their model would have predicted. So here's where there's another stage of the modeling process. So normally you would estimate your structural model, you would do some sort of validation checks, and then use it to run some counterfactual scenarios or to compute some deep parameters of interest. In this case, it might be the willingness to pay for the voucher, which you can then compare with the cost of the program and then get some sort of surplus or welfare estimate from that. But in this case, this lack of ability of the model to fit the data caused the researchers to take a step back and say, well, what are we missing? And how can we make this model even better? And so that's the true true value of this approach is that we can estimate a model on the control villages, and if we've got our model right, if we've got all the right mechanisms, then that will reproduce what's happening in the treatment villages. And in this case, that didn't happen, and so then the researchers were able, in a transparent way, to further adjust their model to see if they could get it to fit the data better and if there were some mechanisms that they were missing. And what they discovered was that there's actually two things missing. So one, the households that applied for the voucher, they actually did their homework. They did some more searching in the market to learn more about the quality of the schools, because they knew they might get a voucher that could be really useful for their family. So this additional search wasn't a part of the original model, but then they realized that they needed to put this into the final version of the model, what they call the unified model in the paper. Second, there was a supply side reaction by the schools. So the schools were actually enrolling siblings of the voucher recipients at much higher rates than expected. And the story here is that the schools were able to capture some of the surplus from the vouchers and then share it with the other siblings in the household in order to increase the enrollment at their school. So in the end, the authors used this unified model that has the best parts of their initial stage model on the control markets and these additional mechanisms that explain why the treatment uptake was higher than the previous model would have expected or would have predicted. And then they estimate this model, which they call the unified model, and then they use it to estimate willingness to pay and compute welfare of the program. So the story here is that by combining experimental and more structural approaches, we can arrive at a more credible answer to an important policy question. And in this case, as you can see in the abstract, the key policy parameter here is whether the program pays for itself or whether it provides more welfare to the households than it costs the government to provide. And they find that it has a marginal value of public funds of at least 3, which means that for every dollar the government puts into this program, the households are getting $3 worth of surplus. So if we kind of do post-mortem what we learned from this new approach that combines different methodologies, if we thought about what a pure experimental approach would have told us, well, it would have told us that if we give people vouchers, they're going to attend private school. I don't think that's particularly surprising. In this particular case, there was another study done on the same data that was just using the experimental approach, and it basically found that there was not a lot of improvement in measurable academic achievement either. So the people who got the vouchers, they weren't necessarily doing better on standardized tests a year or two later. Further, with the experimental only approach, we wouldn't really know anything about the welfare impacts of school vouchers, which is a really important policy question. If we only looked at the structural side, so if we only did the structural model on the control villages, that's like the typical using revealed preference data and estimating it, there's no experiment happening. Well, this would have told us that families like having the option to choose a school. It would have also told us that credit constraints matter, meaning that there's a large number of families that they would like to enroll their children in private school, but they just can't afford it. And so that constraint on their ability to pay is an important part of their choice. But without this experimental validation, we would miss some key behavioral mechanisms that help us better understand how vouchers actually produce welfare gains to households and how households change their behavior in the presence of voucher programs. So with these two approaches together, we were able to compute the true welfare impact of school voucher policies and also obtain a credible estimate of the bang for buck in terms of what the government's paying and what society is receiving. So this can help us understand how better to structure school voucher programs in the future. And this extends beyond just school vouchers. This applies to pretty much any field of empirical economics, anywhere that we care about welfare and policy design. Because in these cases, we often face questions that we can't answer with one method alone. So this study is another example of why structural versus reduced form really misses the point, that there are positives and negatives to each approach, but that when we combine them, we can obtain something that's greater than the sum of its parts. We also learn that the truth is not found in methodological purity, but instead methodological integration. So I hope you've enjoyed this mini-series on structural modeling and that you've learned a few things. I've certainly learned a lot in communicating this to you, so I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.